Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Elena Past. I'm a professor of Italian at Wayne State University and the chair of the President's Standing Committee on Environmental Initiatives. I understand that it's a dark and stormy evening out there in the metro area, so an appropriate evening for our panel, which is titled Dark Waters, Pfas in Michigan. We are very excited to bring you our closing event of Sustainability in Higher Education Month. Green Street, the Office of Campus Sustainability, has put together a whole program of events throughout the month of October to recognize all of the different ways that Wayne State faculty and students, community members are addressing challenges and issues related to sustainability. And this is our closing event. We're so glad you could join us. So what you're seeing on screen is a list of today's panelists. I will introduce each one of them before they speak. Just a moment of Zoom housekeeping. We will ask that you keep your microphones off throughout the event, but at any point, if you have a question for the speakers that you'd like to place in the chat box, you can ask questions throughout the events. We will hold questions and ask them in the Q&A, which will take place at the end. So we are going to start with a screening of the trailer for a film titled Dark Waters, a legal thriller directed by Todd Haynes, written by Mario Correa and Matthew Michael Carnahan. This is a true story. You'll get a little more context about the story in today's presentations. It came out in 2019 and it tells the story of an attorney named Rob Billett who made a case against the chemical manufacturing corporation DuPont after they discovered that they'd been contaminating the town with PFAS chemicals. So we will roll the trailer and then we will begin our panel discussion.
You knew. Still you did nothing.
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains.
Hi, Grammars.
What are you doing here?
Your grandma tells me her grandson's some fancy environment lawyer down in Cincinnati.
I am a corporate defense attorney.
So?
I defend chemical companies.
Well, now you can defend me.
How many did you lose?
190.
190 cows.
You tell me nothing's wrong here.
It's a small matter for a family friend. Help a guy who needs it.
The farmer or you? That's chemicals, I'm telling you.
I'm seeing documents I don't understand.
They're hiding something. That chemical.
What if you drank it? Drank it? It's like saying, what if I swallowed a tire?
What if whatever's killing those cows is in the drinking water?
At DuPont, better living through chemistry. It's our DNA.
You need to tell me what in the hell's going on.
DuPont is knowingly poisoning 70,000 local residents for the last 40 years. You knew, still you did nothing.
You want to flush your career down the toilet for some cowhand?
You want to take everything that you know and turn it against an iconic American company, like an informant. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? Isn't that right?
Yes.
They have all the money, all the firepower, and they'll use it. I know. I was one of them. Our government is captive to DuPont. They're trying to force you to make me stop.
He was willing to risk his job, his family, for a stranger who needed his help.
The system is rigged. They want us to think it'll protect us. We protect us. We do.
All right. So our first speaker, our first panelist today is Professor Marcia Richmond, Professor of History and a Historian of Science. Professor Richmond teaches courses on environmental history, the history of medicine, and Michigan history. And she's currently working on a book on Theo Colburn and the discovery of environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals. So please welcome Marcia Richmond.
Sorry for that. I wanted to talk just a second about the film Dark Waters, and the trailer did a pretty good job giving a synopsis of the film, but it came from this article that appeared in 2016 in the New York Times Magazine, which I saw at the time, and I thought, this is an amazing story, and indeed it was and is. And I think the thing to realize is that it took Robert Billet almost a decade and more. You know, he is still continuing to work on this, just to go through and establish the chain of events that led to DuPont's liability for cleanup and restitution. Does the story have a happy ending, I wondered? Certainly it does, in the sense that in the end, Billet was able to establish DuPont's liability, and they paid out $671 million to thousands of people. But what about the bigger issues in this case? I mean, a lot of those people were had maybe died or had suffered severely. Well, one of the things that came out was a panel, a science panel. It took 8 years for them to establish a link, but they were able to do that, and that's what they used to give some of the personal injury claims. But I think more than that, it's an important outcome is that it kind of raised the eyebrows of a lot of other states, including Michigan, to look for these chemicals in their drinking water. So exactly what are PFAS that are at the core of the dark waters? Well, I want to give you a brief history of the invention of this class of chemicals. After the Second World War, DuPont, Dow, 3M, were looking around. They participated in wartime material, and they were looking around for new products that were going to grow their bottom line. And of course, among these were plastics, these polymers. And it was in fiddling around, literally, almost all of these chemicals were discovered accidentally. Finding their properties because their lack of reactivity was precisely what made them so attractive, both as water repellents, flame retardants, and so on. Well, the first chemical was Teflon, which was accidentally discovered in 1938. It's kind of interesting, I think, that the company that was co-founded by DuPont and General Motors patented this plastic, and the trademark was registered in 1945. So it was 1948 that DuPont began producing Teflon at that Washington Works factory right outside of Parkersburg. So in the film, it's around 1998 or so that it begins. So almost 50 years, right? And the first nonstick cookware was patented in 1961, and I suspect that many of you have cooked out of this Teflon pots and pans. Well, the other chemical, PFAS, was, I find pretty interestingly, accidentally discovered by a woman who had to have been one of the rare female chemists hired by 3M in 1952. She found a chemical. It's got a carbon backbone and fluorine atoms bonded to it that led to the versatile stain repellent we've all used, Scotchgard. Protects our carpet from spills. Well, against this background, Rachel Carson was working about the same time, and in the late 50s, a friend of hers told her about a massive bird kill in a nature preserve that had recently been sprayed with DDT, asked her if she'd look into it. She did. And 4 years later, she published Silent Spring, which argued against the pervasive use of DDT. And some of you may not know that it wasn't just restricted to agriculture. It was used even on swimming pools with children to keep mosquitoes off of them. Well, her book ushered in the modern environmental movement, and that included the creation in 1970 of the EPA. And one of its first acts, in addition to a Clean Water and Clean Air Act, was to ban the production of DDT in the U.S. So things looked like they were getting better. Air and water pollution was getting better in the Great Lakes and so forth, but some other things began to come across the screens of scientists and environmentalists, these chemicals of concern. The major one was discovered by a Swedish scientist, Soren Jensen, in 1972, and he wondered, what was this pollutant? He literally had to do a lot of work to figure out what it was. And PCBs were this miracle chemical that could be used as a flame retardant. So GE used them in a lot of their transformers and so forth. But people began to worry because they began showing up not only in the environment, but in the blood of humans and wildlife. Well, it's against that backdrop that it's interesting to note that a husband and wife team here at Wayne State in the School of Medicine began to look at PCBs in the 1980s. You may know that if they get into the sediment, then the zooplankton and the phytoplankton pick it up, and through the chain of bioaccumulation we'll, I'm sure, be learning more about, they eventually get into fish, and through the fish they get into humans. So the Jacobsons wanted to find out what happened to babies whose moms had eaten Great Lakes fish during pregnancy. Well, they discovered, and they published in 1996, the fact that those children may have had as much as a 6.2 IQ deficit later in life. This was a very big deal. Someone who took note of that was the biologist Theo Colburn, who in 1989 had been commissioned to do a study of the problems in Great Lakes fish, and found out that unlike what was expected from Rachel Carson's work, it wasn't cancer that was causing problems, but there were developmental disorders. And so, building on the Jacobsons' evidence, she called together a group of biomedical researchers in 1991 to take a look at the various data. And at the end of a 3-day meeting, they had a unanimous wing-spread consensus that stated, quote, that a large number of man-made chemicals that have been released into the environment have the potential to disrupt the endocrine system of animals, including humans. Now, these chemicals are everywhere. These endocrine disrupting chemicals are used in a wide variety of the pharmaceuticals, flame retardants, cosmetics, personal care products. They're everywhere. So that disturbed Theo, and she thought that she needed, like Rachel Carson did, to write a popular book that would warn the public and asking whether we are threatening our fertility, intelligence, and our survival. And this set off a number of government regulatory agencies, including the EPA, to begin taking a look at these chemicals. But as we know from dark waters, this did not translate into greater regulation of the PFAS and other endocrine disruptors. Because chemical manufacturers challenge the science, and through their deep pockets, they are able to exert political pressure on legislators and on agencies not to act. Well, how does that lead us to PFAS in Michigan? The dropping the ball, the ability of these corporations to kind of keep these out of the public discourse has been relatively successful until recently with this so-called PFAS crisis. And as troubling, I would suggest, as Flint's drinking waters, lead in the Flint's drinking water is, Ultimately, PFAS is even a greater crisis because it affects so many different peoples, because it's infiltrated the ground and surface water in many areas of Michigan as well as other states. So the state government was first warned about these dangers in 2012, but it wasn't until after the Flint crisis that the governor began to act in 2017, thinking he should get out ahead of this crisis, and he created an informational website. Well, there are many different sites around Michigan, but these are 4 of the major ones. So Rockford, right outside of Grand Rapids. Wolverine Worldwide used Scotchgard. 3M failed to warn them that they needed to protect the discharge, and it got into local wells and streams. Parchment, right outside of Kalamazoo. The paper mill continued to use it in making oil and grease repellents. So popcorn, microwave popcorn containers, and the paper that you wrap meat in and fish in and so forth. The Parchment can no longer use their drinking water, and they're getting their water from Kalamazoo as of last summer. Even Ann Arbor, where a company in Wixom that's part of the automobile industry used it to clean up their chrome plating, and then dumped their discharge waste into the Huron River, which Ann Arbor uses for their drinking water. And then finally, Oscoda, where Wurtsmith Air Base is still, it's closed now, but they for a long time used firefighting foam to smother fires on the air base. And of course, it's used by fire departments all across the state. So it's infiltrated streams and wells in rural areas used for water supplies. And to date, the Air Force hasn't done enough to begin even thinking about a cleanup. Well, there is a little silver lining in that recently the state has introduced extensive water testing and set standards, as we'll learn in a few minutes. So I just want to pose a closing suggestion that for those of you who are familiar with The Sorcerer's Apprentice, I loved the Walt Disney's Fantasia, these chemicals just keep multiplying, because in 1962, when Carson talked about DDT, there were only a few EDCs known, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, pesticides being one. But today the list is in the range of around 80,000, and it's growing all the time. And as we now know, as from Dark Waters tells, and we now know that manufacturers like DuPont and 3M knew about their danger, and yet they were loath to stop manufacturing because they make billions off of them every year. So, you know, whereas the dangers that Rachel Carson discovered about DDT in 1962 was pretty easy to handle. We could just stop producing them. Today, it's not so easy to do so. And these PFAS, as I'm sure that Tracie's going to be saying, are called forever chemicals. That is, they persist in the environment, and it's very difficult to get rid of them. And they not only cause cancer, but developmental defects in people that may not be undetected for years and years, remain undetected. So it may reduce an individual's natural life potential that they got at fertilization. So these pose existential questions. How do we regulate chemicals that have been the basis for America's economic prominence since 1945 and are part of our modern consumer culture? And how can we convince corporations to halt the production of chemicals that are literally worth billions of dollars? And these profits are exactly what enable them to lobby politicians and interfere with EPA and other government agencies. So go back to the question that Theo Colburn posed. Are we endangering the future of humanity? And if so, what can we do about it? And I'm sure the other presenters are going to be able to tell us a lot more about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. That's both alarming and really fascinating, and it's great to get the historical context of fighting these dangerous chemicals in the 20th century. So now we are going to move on to an expert in environmental health sciences. Tracie Baker is assistant professor in the Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and in the Department of Pharmacology in the School of Medicine. She directs Wayne State University's Water Lab. Their work is focused on providing critical insights into transgenerational environmentally induced disease. The lab also has funding to investigate the occurrence and effects of endocrine disruption caused by environmental contaminants in Detroit bodies of water, among other projects. So we're really excited to hear from Tracie and welcome you to the virtual microphone.
Great, thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining us in this important conversation on what was a beautiful Friday afternoon. Has turned into a stormy afternoon, and I am sitting outside, so hopefully the storm does not affect the audio on this. Let's see. Okay, so this statistic or this quote from the end of the movie is one of the reasons why so many of us are concerned about these chemicals. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention and many other organizations have done large studies of thousands of people and found basically that there are PFAS chemicals in the serum of pretty much all of us and all organisms on the planet. There was even a study of pregnant women and their offspring, and it ended up that they were trying to find control populations, and every person in that study ended up having some PFAS in their blood and urine. And this is important, as Marcia had mentioned, in Michigan because of some of the big contaminating events. And we also know that there are very high levels in people that have been found in Michigan. So this is just one case, an extreme case from the Wolverine dump site where this woman had 5 million parts per trillion of PFAS in her blood. So Marcia did a great job talking about this already, so I won't talk too much about it. Most of what we know about PFAS chemicals are from PFAS, P-F-O-S, and PFOA, P-F-O-A. But there are over 5,000 known PFAS chemicals, 3,000 of which are used in consumer goods. And these are called forever chemicals because of the carbon fluorine chain. These are very, very strong bonds. They're resistant to degradation, which causes the chemicals to persist in the environment and also to persist in us and wildlife. So these chemicals can stay in the environment, depending on which compound, from tens to even hundreds of years. They also can bioaccumulate, which means they kind of get in lower, like fish, and then we eat the fish, and so they are accumulating in us, and they kind of up the food chain they're accumulating. And we also know that they are toxic. So we've kind of gone through some of these, compounds that are consumer goods. These are used in stain, grease, and waterproofing. They're found in clothing, plastic, food packaging, electronics, personal care products. I mean, just a whole list of consumer products. So, we've already talked about that as far as human exposure goes. We've talked about, food. And so we're going to talk a little bit about environmental and water exposure. So the Pfas cycle is pretty complicated. Up here we have kind of what we've already talked about as far as consumer products, but we also have these large industries, again, that Marcia talked about, and they're basically the PFAS that they are producing. Some of it is going into wastewater that's directly discharged into streams and lakes. Other of these chemicals are going through wastewater treatment plants. And the issue with that is that it's been found that these chemicals do not get broken down for the most part, a lot of them in wastewater treatment plants and drinking water treatment plants. So this figure over here is kind of showing that before and after treatment, it's not changing. So some compounds, you know, they are being taken out during this, and a lot of PFAS contaminants, that's not the case. So then that effluent is also being discharged into rivers. Also, wastewater treatment plants use part of the solids that come out of that process for fertilizers. So a lot of farmers use that for fertilizers. It's been shown that these contaminants can then get into food products. These are food products that we eat. These are also products that are fed to livestock. So then again, that bioaccumulation where, you know, they're going into livestock and then, you know, we eat them, meat and eggs and milk, and we can get contamination or exposure in that way. And so then there's also runoff, and all of these can get into groundwater, which can get into wells in areas where wells are, you know, used for drinking water sources. And another thing that's kind of a newer finding is that the PFAS chemicals can also go up into the air. And they can come down in rainfall, and they can even travel large distances in air currents. And they've been found in the Arctic in polar bears because of this is what they think. So I just want to mention briefly that my lab has looked in the Detroit River. So this is Lake St. Clair, and this is the Detroit River. We've looked at 15 sites over the last 3 years at water and sediment, and every single site had PFAS, detectable PFAS levels in those sites. So it's relevant to us in the Detroit metro area as well. So also, as Marcia mentioned, these PFAS chemicals are endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are also part of a class, you know, of BPA and some pharmaceuticals. And so these endocrine disrupting chemicals, basically they can act as hormones and they can disrupt hormones at low levels. So, you know, in our bodies, we don't have high levels of hormones. So anything that regulates them, even minutely, can have an effect on our health. So it really just takes low doses to affect our health. There's wide ranges of effects, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it can affect humans as well as wildlife, and these can really lead to long-lasting effects. So EDCs is what I'm talking specifically about here, can be linked to obesity, infertility, diabetes, autism, behavioral learning disorders, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, and several forms of cancer. And our research and others have shown that a single contaminant can lead to fertility declines, and as well as declines in learning ability and memory, even at a part per trillion level. And this is similar basically to a pinch of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So we see these health effects not only in adults, particularly when they were exposed at younger ages, but also we see the same health effects can persist at least 2 more generations. So that's to say that basically this is because it can change genes being turned on and off. And so, you know, if grandpa was exposed to a chemical, that could lead to disease in a granddaughter, even if they're not directly exposed to this chemical. So the products that we're using every day can come back to hurt us. And so these are specific human effects that have been seen due to PFAS chemicals. Again, this is mostly those 2 chemicals. So we talked about PFAS persisting in the environment. It also these can stay in our body. So PFOS can stay, the half-life in humans is over 5 years. And PFOA is from 2 to 4 years. So these can stay in our body for a long time. You can see the number of, you know, different systems and health effects that we can see as well as several different kinds of cancer, effects on the immune system. Another concerning thing is that PFAS chemicals, a lot of them can cross the placenta barrier, so they can get to the unborn child. And so in offspring, there are some studies that have shown obesity and early onset puberty, as well as low sperm counts in the offspring of women that have been exposed. And then just talking about pets and livestock and wildlife, most of the available information on these are due to studies in laboratory animals. And again, mostly due to the PFOA, the two chemicals. As seen in the movie, you can see liver disease, thyroid disease, a lot of the same diseases that we've seen in humans. Birds can be particularly sensitive to airborne emissions, especially when you're using Teflon, because the overheating of the Teflon gets into their respiratory system and can be fatal. So from fish to in the Great Lakes to polar bears in the Arctic, studies are kind of ongoing about population health effects in wildlife. And at this time, agencies recommend drinking water for pets and livestock meet the same safety standards as it does for people. So I keep saying that, most of what we know are due to those two chemicals. They're being phased out. Teflon stopped using PFOA in 2013. The US banned PFOA in 2014. And so these companies are reformulating these safer replacements or environmentally friendly alternatives. But these can still cause effects, and some of these so they're kind of called long chain and short chain. These short chain chemicals, in the environment and in treatment processes can recombine to make longer chains. And you can see that there's, these can be more mobile, remediation can be more difficult. So, and we don't know a lot about these short chain chemicals. So a lot of these things are just being studied right now. So, I hate being the bearer of bad news, and I feel like I'm always, talking about the bad things that are going on. And people often ask, so, what can we do as consumers? What can we do? So just some of the things, here's a bunch of consumer products that have these chemicals in them. You can consider replacing nonstick cookware with ceramic coated stainless steel, glass, or cast iron. Pay attention to shampoos, lotions, detergents, and fertilizers that you're using. Try to find simpler ingredients. As far as the fast food and basically what we're, some of the food exposure that we're getting, try eating real food. So fresh food and drinks that are not processed or made with synthetic chemicals. Try to make microwave popcorn, or try not to microwave popcorn, and make popcorn on the stovetop. And finally, support research to redesign commercial products and sewage treatment facilities. And so in closing, my advice is to insist that science is used to inform government regulations and create demand for products that generate profit from our health rather than pollution and disease.
Thank you so much, Tracie. Again, really fascinating, alarming, really interesting to see those generational jumps. The fact that you have to worry about it not just for one generation, but for many, and then also to see the way that it sort of falls out of the skies as well as infiltrates water systems. But your final question about regulation leads us perfectly into our final presentation by Lance Gable, who's Associate Professor of Law at Wayne State University Law School. He's an internationally known expert on public health law and bioethics. Professor Gable teaches courses on public health, bioethics and the law, torts, and other health law subjects, and his research addresses the overlap between law, policy, ethics, health, and science. He's published articles on public health law and on other topics as well. And so we welcome Professor Gable to the mic.
Oh, thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be here today. to be with you on a Friday afternoon talking about this really important topic. And I think, one thing that we've already covered here, I think very clearly, is the potential risk of these chemicals, the fact that as much as we already know at this point about their health consequences, we're still learning more and more all the time as researchers are continuing to study their effects. And even beyond that, just the proliferation of these different chemicals and the continued research and development that goes on through chemical companies developing these substances and not really knowing the kinds of ultimate health impacts they have, creates really not only a health problem, but it also creates a policy problem, because we often don't find out about these consequences until long after they've already taken root. And if there's an important lesson that I think we can take out of the Rachel Carson story with DDT, it's that that sometimes the way that these risks become not only known to the public but also become addressable through the law and policy infrastructure that can protect us from some of these risks only really happens when they come to light. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from the Dark Waters story as well, that it took some really concerted action that combined the efforts of scientists and lawyers and others, the media included, to try to really bring to light the risks of some of these substances. And so one question that we should be asking ourselves, and it's one that I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, is there really a way that we can be more preemptive about this, that we can try to get ahead of these health harms and avoid having to address them retrospectively after they've already occurred? And so I'm going to really focus most of my comments today on the law and talk a little bit about the structure of the law in regulating PFAS and other kinds of chemicals that might pose a risk to human health. But then I'm going to talk about federal law and state law, and then a little bit about how litigation plays into this process and what role that it plays. And then end up where I just started, which is thinking about how can law prevent harm and how can law protect health, what things should we be thinking about in trying to use those tools more effectively to try to minimize the harm posed by these kinds of substances. So to start with federal law, there are a number of overlapping federal laws, and there's a federal legal infrastructure that's in place to protect against harm to human health from chemicals. And a lot of this actually comes out of the aftermath of the episode with DDT, where Rachel Carson really brought to the public the information about the riskiness of this chemical, the fact that it was causing harm to human health. That really spurred the environmental movement, but it also spurred, as Marcia mentioned already, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the federal agency that is responsible for protecting the environment, but by extension protecting human health from factors that might pollute the environment, including chemicals like PFAS chemicals. And so in addition to the creation of the EPA, you start seeing around the early 1970s the development of the enactment of a number of pieces of legislation. So you get the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and then later on the Safe Drinking Water Act, all passed in the early part of the 1970s, actually during the Nixon administration. And these laws create a mechanism for the federal government to regulate the kinds of pollutants that can go into air and water, to monitor them, and also to potentially ban them if they're deemed to be too harmful to human health, or if not ban them, then at least regulate them and regulate the amount that can be released into the environment, whether it be into the water supply, whether it be into the air. And so the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was passed in 74, was designed to protect the drinking water supplies. So this is the water coming out of the tap, and under the Safe Drinking Water Act, as it's been amended over the years, the EPA has the ability to regulate contaminants to the water supply. It has the ability to create maximum contaminant levels for chemicals that it's regulating. And there are dozens and dozens of chemicals that the EPA does regulate, but it does not actually regulate PFAS chemicals under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so it hasn't established maximum contaminant levels that are formally in place for these chemicals. And so there's advisory guidance from the EPA that says that PFAS chemicals should not exceed 70 parts per trillion in drinking water, but those are not they're not in place through formal regulation. They're not enforceable directly. The fact that Tracie mentioned it in her comments that PFOS had been banned, PFOA, that they were taken out of Teflon. They were taken out of Teflon as a part of a voluntary agreement between the EPA and DuPont and some of the other companies that were manufacturing these materials. And so they still can be made in other parts of the world, and they still can be imported. The EPA supposedly is monitoring the importation of these chemicals from other parts of the world, but again, they're not strictly banned, and there's kind of a patchwork of protections against these kinds of chemicals being released into the environment right now. In addition, and of course that doesn't address chemicals that are already here, as was already mentioned by both Tracie and Marcia, that these are forever chemicals. They don't just go away, and so they're still existing in our existing materials and all that's been produced over the last half century. In addition to Safe Drinking Water Act, there's also the Toxic Substances Control Act, which allows for reporting requirements, and it also requires businesses to report chemicals to the EPA that they're using. Otherwise, we would have no idea what chemicals are being used. However, the Toxic Substances Control Act does not require the EPA to reveal these chemicals to the public. They're kept confidential under business privacy rules that are in place. There's CERCLA, which is also the Superfund Act, which is designed to enable cleanups of toxic sites that would include chemicals, including PFAS chemicals. Again, but CERCLA doesn't specifically regulate PFAS chemicals. And so you're starting to see a theme here, right? So these federal laws that are in place have the potential to regulate these chemicals, but have done so either not at all or only minimally. And so there's actually an opportunity here for these federal powers to be used more widely than they already have been. Under the Trump administration, there hasn't been much action on this front, as you might imagine. They've been more focused on deregulatory efforts in terms of environmental regulations. But there is a PFAS action plan that the EPA has promulgated that acknowledges the problem and talks about guidance, but hasn't made much of an effort to legally restrict the use of PFAS or the release of PFAS any further. And so that leaves the states, right? The states have the ability to enact their own provisions that are more protective of public health and the environment than exists in federal law. The Flint water crisis was a real wake-up call in Michigan to the need to restructure our state government to have a more effective environmental enforcement. And so the new State Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, Eagle, has been more proactive in the last 2 years in trying to regulate PFAS chemicals. In fact, under state law now, at levels that were just set in August of this year, Michigan limits the PFOS to 16 parts per trillion and PFOA to 8 parts per trillion in water, and has the authority to regulate, not only to test for those chemicals, but also to regulate companies that might be introduced, or sources that might be introducing them into the water supply. And so that's a great advance. Now, if we look nationwide, of course, we see that there are, most other states are behind Michigan. Michigan has been out front. A couple of other states, including New Jersey and Vermont, also have similarly low levels for PFAS levels in water. But most states have not yet moved to try to closely regulate these chemicals. And so in many parts of the country, the regulation is much more lax. And then finally, I want to mention, because I know my time is getting short, the role of litigation. So one thing that the movie shows really clearly is that because powerful chemical companies and corporations often have a great deal of influence and actually are successful in lobbying both federal and state governments to not closely regulate these chemicals, and they don't have to necessarily even reveal what they are. unless they're preemptively regulated by these regulatory agencies. Sometimes it takes litigation to really bring this information into the light. And the litigation here was effective, although it took more than a decade, in obtaining information about the nature of these chemicals and their risks, revealing the fact that the company knew that they were exposing people to these chemicals for years and that they were health risks, but not taking any steps to warn anyone about this or to reduce the introduction of the chemicals into the environment in the first place. And ultimately, there was some compensation that the different plaintiffs were able to recover, people who were exposed and their families. But this happened much after the fact, and this is one of the real. So litigation has the advantage of allowing for compensation for people who are harmed after the fact, also revealing information that wouldn't have otherwise been revealed. But it has the limitation of having to happen retrospectively and not always really being able to cover everyone who's been harmed. There are many people who've been affected by this exposure that were not part of these lawsuits and have not received any kind of compensation in any way. And the best strategy is to not have to do this retrospectively, it's to do this prospectively. And that leads me to my final slide, which, just to kind of summarize these points, regulation of chemicals always lags behind their development and their introduction into the environment. Regulation happens more slowly than scientific innovation. We don't employ Marcia mentioned the wing spread statement, and that one of the things that came out of that statement was the precautionary principle, the idea that you don't introduce new chemicals or harmful products into the environment until you know the effects that they have on human health. We don't follow that with our environmental laws. We allow for chemicals to be introduced before we know their effects. We're much more protective of things like pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And so, we might want to take a more precautionary approach, but it would require amending our laws to be able to do that. And finally, litigation plays an important role, but it has some limitations in what it can really accomplish. So I'm going to stop because I know I'm over time, but I just looking forward to all of your questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for a really rich and important overview of the challenges that we face with PFAS in our state. We are going to open the floor for questions. We will invite anyone who'd like to raise their hand. You can click on your participants button and you can raise a hand if you'd like to ask it in viva voce. If you'd like to ask a question in the chat, we welcome questions there as well. And I will grab questions from the chat and ask our panelists. But again, if you'd like to speak up, you are welcome. So the first question goes out to all of the panelists. It comes from Nick DePaula, who wonders about the claim that the Detroit Water Department says they have one of the world's cleanest and safest drinking water supplies. He wonders if you would agree, and whether or not PFAS and other endocrine disrupting chemicals are being included in assessments of the quality of local tap water.
Tracie, is that something that you could address?
Yeah, originally I was thinking that was a Lance question, but yeah, as far as I know, it is not something that's being, it's not one of the, it's not like lead and mercury, like a lot of contaminants that need to be measured. PFAS is not one of those. There are several water institutes or authorities that are like, they do measure PFAS and PFOA, but so most of the ones that I know that are measuring are just measuring those two kind of legacy compounds. Lance, I don't know if you have more on that or not.
I don't have anything specific on that. I know that under the new state regulations, that enables monitoring, and it authorizes the state government to be tracking PFAS levels much more closely. I think that would enable the local governments to also be doing that monitoring, whether it's the health departments or whether it's environmental quality officials at both state and local levels to be taking those measurements. But I don't think it requires locals to be doing that affirmatively. But I'm not 100% sure about that, and so that I don't want to take that as the absolute last word on this. It's something that actually is. I think it illustrates something of the complexity because there certainly could be monitoring prescribed, but then the question is monitoring for which chemicals. Is it only PFOS and PFOA, or is it a whole spectrum of chemicals? And what are we expecting? And I mean, ideally, we'd monitor for as many of them as we could, but actually implementing that is a bit of a challenge too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole slew of contaminants of emerging concern, and PFAS is one of them. Even though it's been around for a long time, we're just realizing the health effects. And so, all of those are not regulated to be tested by our water authorities.
I can say a little something because I've looked into some of the companies that are beginning to produce equipment that water companies can purchase. It's incredibly expensive, though, to take the PFAS out. And I think the process is reverse osmosis, and that it's some of the lawsuits. For example, I know, Lance, you may know that Michigan is suing 3M to recuperate some of the money that they're having to spend over in Rockford. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that they're doing is to give local water companies the money that it would require to put in something that will take PFAS out of the water system. But not very many municipalities, particularly in the era of COVID, are going to have the money that they're going to be able to do that unless we get a lot of grant and state money. Maybe like Minnesota, Michigan might get a big windfall suing 3M.
Yeah, and this approach, trying to recoup expenses from manufacturers like this. I mean, we've seen this approach used in some other contexts. We've seen it used with tobacco companies. We've seen it used with opioid manufacturers. With municipalities and state governments trying to recoup their expenses from the health harms caused by the products. And sometimes these approaches work, but it is usually a really long process. And in this case, if they are successful, it's probably going to be a number of years before they would have any chance of getting that money. And so going through the entire process of litigation and appeals can often take a decade or more.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research being done as far as remediation goes, but it's all pretty much, I mean, just at the research level right now. So I think it'll be a while till we see that implemented.
So thank you. You're actually dovetailing perfectly into two questions. I was going to transition to a legal question next, since you were talking about regulatory powers, Lance. David Pitts asked if there are other regulatory models that we should consider that are currently being used elsewhere. Does Europe have a more or a different strategy regarding PFAS and these chemicals, or are there models that we can use from other places around the world?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things about this is that because it's only been a few years since, well, I mean, we've known these chemicals are potentially hazardous for a while, but surprisingly, even jurisdictions that are usually a little bit more proactive in regulating chemicals, including the European Union, they haven't really jumped on this in the way that they have with some other kinds of things like GMO, for example. I mean, the European Union has taken some initial steps to adopt caps on the amount of PFAS contaminants in the water supply, for example, but they're still in process. And so it's really, I think, only last year or early this year when they started to try to implement that process, and it's not been fully completed yet. And the levels that they're proposing are 100 parts per trillion, which is actually lower than the recommendation by the EPA. And so, but now in terms of different regulatory models, I mean, I think that we have the tools in federal and state laws that we could use to implement much more strict limitations, but we just have to be willing to implement them with regard to these chemicals in particular. And so I think the tools are there, but the implementation and the political will to take the steps necessary to add these chemicals to the list of chemicals that we're closely restricting, that's something that we haven't really done in any kind of consistent way yet, and that's the opportunity.
And my understanding was that there are in Europe, certain European countries, more regulations, maybe not on PFAS in general, but there are more, it's more tested like pharmaceuticals are here, where they have to go through safety tests before, there's more stages before it can just be released. Whereas here, products are released, and then, as you were saying, Lance, after the fact, we come back and try to remediate or change it.
Yeah, that's right.
I do know that in the case of the EU that they are moving toward regulating endocrine disrupting chemicals a lot more than we are doing. And it's rather interesting because Theo Colburn had a big impact on that. And a lot of people in Europe kind of took her work and ran with it. And it's not as simple as we might think, I mean, because European chemical companies are as powerful as Dow and 3M and DuPont, but for some reason they've been able to get, I think, more legislation in. I'm going to be working on that a little bit with the book on Theo Colburn that I'm working on.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, an effort at the UN level to try to implement more global limitations on the use of these chemicals. And obviously, you know, that always comes with challenges for enforcement, but at least it raises the issue at a global level, which will probably incentivize more countries globally to take some kinds of steps to protect against exposure to PFAS.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm mindful of the fact that it's almost 5 o'clock on a Friday. We have 2 more questions in the chat, and I'd like to start with the simpler one and then ask the more complex one as our closing question. So Jenna Steele asks a question about products, sort of consumer awareness question. Can water filters like a Brita filter out PFAS or chemicals from our drinking water?
So they're not designed to, I guess, is part of the answer. They're more designed to remove heavy metals and chlorines, but if they have activated carbon in them, we do know that PFAS, at least some of the PFAS chemicals, will bind to that. So they will likely, but kind of as was mentioned earlier, reverse osmosis is kind of the gold standard for trying to take these chemicals out.
I know that there are a few products on the market that you can buy for your household, but they cost several $100s. So it's a class issue as well, right? And it's environmental justice issue. So.
Yeah, but the carbon, if there's carbon in them, they will likely be removing some.
Okay, so I think our wrap-up question, which maybe all of the panelists can address from different perspectives, it comes from Camille Bedford, and I'm going to add a little spin on it as well. She says PFAS can be generational and that it's the forever chemical. How recently have we known that it was a forever chemical, and then is there a time where we won't see PFAS in our blood? So I thought that future-looking question, the idea of how long this stretches out and how you think about time in a question like this, is interesting, and also ties to Marcia's work with environmental history, since you're talking about how, you know, we've really built our understanding of these chemicals over a history of environmental activism and awareness, but you've also talked about how different this case is and how this accumulation of chemicals is massive and really different from what existed in Rachel Carson's time. So I'm wondering if we can sort of think both backwards and forwards and ask where this has gotten us and what the future looks like.
It's interesting in a way. If you look at the longue durée, I've done a little work on, not just on Rachel Carson, but on another woman who was a geneticist, and in the 1950s published a little book to try to alert people to some of the dangers from radiation exposure that came in after the war. And this little book is called Genetics in the Atomic Age, and it's by Charlotte Auerbach. And both Carson and Auerbach were very concerned. I call this a part of maternalism, where you're looking at the problems with future generations. And in the 50s, people didn't know very much about mutations, right? And few people had ever studied genetics. And so it again was a book at people and trying to get the public to be aware of such things. I really, with my reference to the Sorcerer's Apprentice, I think it's going to be very difficult, and I think that it's very important for people to put a lot of pressure on their legislators. Legislators. We've done a good job in Michigan, because I know even just a year ago they were not. The legislature wasn't very interested in this issue. But this is a longue durée question, and you know, Tracie probably knows better than I do how long these chemicals are going to last in future generations.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hard question. The chemicals, as Marcia said, you know, they've actually been around for a long time. We just didn't realize that they were there and that they were bad for us. I mean, they were being studied in the 70s, but they thought to some degree that it was from the fluorine that they were finding, they thought was due to fluoride in the water, not necessarily that there was this whole slew of PFAS chemicals. So it's really been pretty recently that these have been discovered. There have been ways to test for, I think 40 or so is all that can really be tested for at this, you know, if you're doing like an EPA method or something like that. And that's a high. A lot of them are 20. So, you know, it's really hard to say, but, you know, some of these stay in our body. If I drank some in the water right now, it would be in my body, you know, for 5 to 10 years. So, you know, it's going to be a while till, even if PFAS intake stopped right now, we would still have PFAS in our bodies for another, you know, 10 or so years. And then you think of the implications of effects being passed on to next generations. Yeah, I agree. It's going to take a while.
Yeah, and one thing that can be done is for probably the federal government, but even state governments, to the extent that they can, to continue to fund research into removal of PFAS from the environment. And I know that's a challenging process, and there are going to be a lot of places where we really can't remove it from where it is. But to the extent that we can, you know, I mean, talking about the Brita filter, I mean, I don't know what the feasibility of, you know, including PFAS filtering to municipal water systems that would remove it more comprehensively, or other kinds of things that we might be able to do, or, you know, replacing materials that contain the chemicals that we're trying to avoid exposing people to. I mean, there might be some other strategies. Of course, it would require not only a lot more research, but also a lot more infrastructure investment to do that. And, you know, that's something that would require, obviously, a lot of political will.
Yeah, my understanding is to try to set up something like reverse osmosis on that large of a scale is very cost prohibitive.
So we've got to do something to put pressure on the chemical manufacturers, right? I'm a big advocate of green chemistry, and I think that environmentalists are pushing that as well, and it's not nearly as lucrative, and that's one of the things our corporate culture is not amenable. You know, they like the $1 billion that come in from these things. So it's a problem. There's a new book that's coming out in February by, I should have mentioned it in my talk, by a woman who has done some work on endocrine disruption, and her name is Shana Swan, S-W-A-N is her last name. I've already pre-ordered it from Amazon, but it's called Countdown: How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, altering male and female reproductive development, and imperiling the future of the human race. And I suspect, like Theo Colburn's book, it's going to be another blockbuster. And I think people, that's what we have to do. I mean, how many people are having trouble conceiving these days, right? It's not their fault.
Wow, a big thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our guests. We're so grateful that you could all join us today for this conversation. It's discouraging and alarming, but it is not without hope, as I think our panelists made clear. These are some places that you can get further information and some places where you can also get involved. We also welcome your involvement in sustainability efforts at Wayne State. If you visit the website, sustainability.wayne.edu, we would love to have everyone who's interested on campus joining in all kinds of different ways. It really is a multidisciplinary effort, as I think today's roundtable amply demonstrated, and there's room for everyone at the table. So thank you so much to Tracie and Marcia and Lance. Thanks everyone for joining us. We really have enjoyed the month of learning and getting sort of set for activism ahead. We wish you a wonderful weekend, and thanks for joining us on Green Street. Take care. Happy Friday, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.